In this episode, we are bringing together several ideas you have already been building and turning them into one of the most practical review activities in the CRISC journey. Reviewing risk and control analysis for gaps assessment is the process of looking at what the organization knows about its risks, what it believes its controls are doing, and where meaningful weaknesses, mismatches, or blind spots still remain. For a brand new learner, this matters because risk work is not finished once risks are listed and controls are described. The organization still has to ask whether its current understanding is complete enough, whether the controls in place actually address the risks that matter most, and whether any important exposure is still left uncovered or only partially addressed. That final review step is where a lot of hidden weakness becomes visible because it forces people to compare what should be protected, what is currently being done, and what important space still exists between those two realities. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is by understanding what a gap actually is in this context. A gap is not just any imperfection or inconvenience. It is a meaningful difference between the level of risk the organization faces and the level of control, visibility, or management discipline it currently has in place to address that risk. Sometimes the gap is a missing control, such as no formal review for privileged access or no tested fallback for a critical third-party service. Sometimes the gap is more subtle, such as a control that exists on paper but is applied inconsistently, or a risk that has been identified in broad terms without enough analysis to support a confident decision. A beginner should notice that gaps can appear in both risk analysis and control analysis. The organization may misunderstand the exposure itself, or it may understand the exposure reasonably well but still lack adequate action to keep that exposure within acceptable limits. That means a gaps assessment is not merely a hunt for absent controls. It is a broader review of whether the organization's current understanding and current safeguards line up well enough with the business and technology risks it is trying to manage. In some cases, a risk may be analyzed too loosely, leaving leadership without clear visibility into business impact, ownership, or likely scenarios. In other cases, the risk may be well understood, yet the control environment may still be weak, outdated, poorly owned, or misaligned with the way the organization actually operates. A strong review asks both kinds of questions. Do we truly understand this exposure? And are we managing it in a way that makes sense for its importance? For a new learner, this is an important distinction because it shows that gaps assessment is about alignment. It compares risk reality, analytical understanding, and control response to see where the organization still has unresolved weakness. One reason this review matters so much is that organizations often become comfortable too early. They identify risks, document controls, assign ratings, and then assume the basic work is complete. But risk analysis can still be shallow, controls can still be weak, and the overall picture can still leave major business exposure unresolved even if the documentation looks organized. A gaps assessment challenges that false comfort by asking whether the pieces truly fit together. If a critical process depends on a third-party platform, for example, it is not enough to note that vendor risk exists and that a contract is in place. The organization also needs to know whether service dependency has been analyzed in enough depth, whether fallback arrangements exist, whether performance is monitored, and whether residual exposure remains higher than leadership intended. This is why gaps assessment is such a valuable CRISC activity. It moves the organization from simple recognition of risk toward a more honest understanding of where important protection is still incomplete. A strong review usually begins with the risk side of the picture, because control gaps are easier to judge when the underlying exposure is understood clearly. The organization needs to ask whether identified risks are described well enough, whether important scenarios have been considered, whether business impact has been evaluated realistically, and whether ownership, likelihood, and residual exposure have been thought through with enough discipline. A weak risk analysis can create its own kind of gap. If the organization has only vague statements about cyber risk, system failure, or vendor dependence, it may be impossible to decide what level of control is actually needed. In other words, weak analysis leads to weak control thinking. For beginners, this is one of the most important habits to develop. Before asking whether the control environment is enough, ask whether the organization has described the risk in a way that is specific, credible, and connected to real business consequences. A blurry view of risk almost always produces blurry decisions about how to respond. Then the review turns to the control side, where the organization examines what safeguards, oversight, and recovery measures are already present and whether they meaningfully address the analyzed risk. This is where control identification and control effectiveness evaluation come back into the picture. A gaps assessment asks whether current controls are preventive, detective, corrective, or recovery-oriented in the right combination for the risk at hand. It also asks whether controls are designed appropriately, whether they operate consistently, and whether they still fit the current environment as systems, vendors, data flows, and business priorities continue to change. A control that was once enough may no longer be enough because the process became more critical, the system became more exposed, or the organization adopted new technology without updating surrounding safeguards. For a new learner, this is a valuable reminder that a control gap is not always a total absence. Sometimes the gap exists because the control is too weak, too narrow, too manual, too outdated, or too poorly governed for the level of risk the organization now carries. One of the most useful ways to review for gaps is to compare risks and controls side by side and ask a series of disciplined questions. Is each significant risk tied to one or more controls that actually address the conditions creating the exposure? Are those controls operating at the right depth, with the right ownership, and at the right point in the process? Are important controls creating evidence that they work, or is the organization relying mainly on assumption? Are some controls duplicated while other important risks remain thinly covered or not covered at all? This side-by-side thinking is powerful because it reveals not just missing pieces, but imbalance. An organization may have many safeguards around a highly visible issue while a quieter but business-critical risk has only weak review or informal oversight. For beginners, this is one of the central ideas in gaps assessment. The goal is not simply more controls. The goal is appropriate coverage, where meaningful risks are met with meaningful and dependable responses rather than scattered effort or uneven attention. Coverage is especially important because one of the most common gap patterns is incomplete control coverage across a risk scenario. A risk may begin in one place and create harm through several connected conditions, yet the organization may only control part of that path. For example, a fraud-related risk may involve user awareness, approval design, transaction monitoring, escalation procedures, and post-event review. If the organization has training but weak approvals, or strong approvals but poor monitoring, or decent monitoring but slow escalation, the overall risk may still remain too high. This is why gaps assessment should think in terms of end-to-end exposure rather than isolated control points. A beginner should picture a chain rather than a single lock. If one part of the chain is weak enough, the business may still experience harm even though some individual controls looked reasonable when examined alone. Reviewing the whole path helps reveal whether protection is continuous enough to reduce the exposure in a practical way. Ownership gaps are another major issue, and they are often more serious than they first appear. A control may exist, a risk may be documented, and a treatment plan may even be listed. Yet if nobody clearly owns the risk or the control, the gap remains significant because maintenance, review, and escalation are likely to weaken over time. A gaps assessment therefore asks whether responsibility is specific, understood, and connected to authority. Is there a risk owner who understands the business consequence and can support decisions about acceptance, treatment, or escalation? Is there a control owner who ensures the safeguard actually operates, collects evidence, resolves exceptions, and raises concerns when the control begins to slip? For beginners, this is a very important point because organizations often mistake documentation for accountability. The gap is not closed simply because a name appears on a sheet. The gap closes only when the responsible role understands the expectation, has the authority to act, and actually remains engaged with the condition over time. Evidence gaps matter just as much because many organizations feel more confident in their controls than their evidence actually supports. A review process may be expected monthly, but the evidence may show irregular timing or superficial completion. A backup program may exist, but restoration may rarely be tested. A vendor review process may be documented, but evidence may reveal that follow-up on issues is inconsistent. In each of those cases, the control appears to exist, yet there is a gap between expectation and proof of effective operation. This kind of weakness is especially important in CRISC thinking because risk management depends on reliable visibility. If leaders cannot tell whether controls are genuinely working, then residual risk cannot be judged with much confidence. For a new learner, the big takeaway is that evidence is what turns belief into knowledge. A gaps assessment should therefore look closely at whether the organization has enough reliable information to support its own claims about control performance and risk reduction. Timing and frequency also create gaps, especially when controls are technically present but not timely enough for the exposure they are meant to manage. An access review performed once a year may be far too slow for a fast-changing environment with sensitive data and frequent role changes. Monitoring that detects suspicious activity after several days may not be strong enough where losses or disruption can spread in hours. Recovery processes that are only tested infrequently may not inspire confidence for a service the business cannot afford to lose even briefly. These timing issues matter because control effectiveness is not only about existence and quality. It is also about speed and rhythm. A beginner should understand that a control can be real and still leave a gap if it happens too late, too rarely, or too slowly to prevent or contain the consequences the organization is most concerned about. In that sense, timing is part of control design, and a good gaps assessment treats it as a serious question rather than a minor administrative detail. Gaps can also appear because the business and technology environment has changed faster than the control environment. This happens often when organizations adopt new platforms, expand vendor dependence, centralize data, move services to the cloud, or automate processes without fully rethinking surrounding risk and control expectations. A control set that once matched the environment may become weaker as architecture changes, user populations expand, or operational dependence becomes more concentrated. The organization may still be working from an older assumption about how the system is used or how important the process is, while actual exposure has moved well beyond that older picture. For beginners, this is one of the strongest reasons gaps assessment has to be ongoing. It is not simply a quality review of old work. It is a reality check that asks whether the analysis and controls still fit the current operating environment rather than the environment the organization remembers from an earlier phase of maturity, growth, or technology design. A well-run gaps assessment also looks for patterns, not just single weaknesses. If multiple critical processes have weak ownership, inconsistent evidence, limited monitoring, or outdated manual controls, then the organization may have a broader governance or operating model issue rather than a set of unrelated local problems. In the same way, if risk entries are repeatedly vague, if treatment plans regularly stall, or if control testing shows recurring weakness in review-based safeguards, those patterns tell leadership something important about the organization's maturity. This matters because some gaps should be treated at the enterprise level rather than fixed one by one in isolation. For a new learner, pattern recognition is a major part of becoming useful in risk work. You are not only identifying individual shortfalls, you are also learning to see what those shortfalls say about the way the organization governs risk, supports controls, trains owners, and responds to evidence that something important is drifting out of acceptable condition. Several misconceptions can make gaps assessment weaker than it should be. One is the belief that a gap exists only when nothing is present, when in reality partial, outdated, misaligned, poorly evidenced, or weakly owned controls can create equally important gaps. Another is the assumption that control quantity means control adequacy, even though many controls can still leave critical exposure unresolved if they do not address the right part of the risk path. Some organizations also treat the assessment as a fault-finding exercise rather than a learning exercise, which can lead teams to defend the current state instead of reviewing it honestly. Others focus so much on technical controls that they miss process, ownership, evidence, or escalation gaps that are just as dangerous. For beginners, the most important correction is this: a gaps assessment is not about proving failure. It is about understanding the distance between current reality and acceptable management of risk so the organization can act before that distance turns into preventable business harm. A simple example makes this easier to see. Imagine a company identifies a risk that a critical payroll process could be disrupted by failure in a third-party hosted platform. The organization has a contract with the provider, receives uptime reports, and has general vendor review meetings, so it may feel reasonably protected. But a gaps assessment reveals deeper issues. There is no tested manual fallback if the platform becomes unavailable during payroll week. Ownership of the business risk is vague. Monitoring focuses on service availability rather than data accuracy, and no one has reviewed whether the provider's recent architectural changes affect recovery expectations. In that example, the gap is not merely that one control is missing. The gap is that the total analysis and control response do not yet align with the importance and timing of the payroll process. That kind of insight is exactly what makes gaps assessment so useful. It reveals where the organization's current risk response still falls short of what the business truly needs. When you step back and look at the whole picture, reviewing risk and control analysis for gaps assessment becomes one of the clearest ways an organization tests whether its risk management is truly connected, current, and decision-ready. It compares risk understanding to control response, checks whether coverage is sufficient, examines ownership and evidence, notices where timing or change has created mismatch, and helps leadership see where meaningful exposure still remains unresolved. For a new learner, the most important takeaway is that good risk management does not end with identifying risks or listing controls. It requires asking whether those risks are understood deeply enough and whether the controls surrounding them are strong enough, well-governed enough, and timely enough to keep the organization within acceptable boundaries. A strong gaps assessment answers that question honestly, and when it does, it gives the business a much better chance to close important weaknesses before uncertainty becomes disruption, loss, or damaged trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.